Corporate fraud works best in the shadows, behind corporate walls. How does the government bring these wrongdoers to justice? Whistleblowers. These are the stories of those who risk their careers to shine a light on allegations of fraud. Today on Fraud in America.
On today's episode of Fraud in America, we are going to look beyond the headlines and beyond the numbers in one of the more interesting fraud cases from the past decade. It is the story of Trevor Milton and Nikola Motors, as told by the whistleblower attorney who helped unmask an alleged fraud that prosecutors say cost investors hundreds of millions of dollars. You see, Mr. Milton raised more than $1 billion with claims that his company's semi-truck could produce zero emissions and nothing but clean, pure water. However, in convicting Mr. Milton of federal fraud charges, the prosecutors presented evidence that his claims were outright lies. Those alleged lies got past the market, government regulators, and the media. Indeed, they surfaced only because a team of courageous whistleblowers teamed up to shine a truth light on the alleged fraud. We discuss this story on today's episode of Fraud in America. So, Mark, I appreciate you joining us on this episode of Fraud in America.
Happy to be here.
In the intro, I talked about, where this case ultimately ends up, in a courtroom in Manhattan with a conviction. But your exposure to this case, that Trevor Milton and Nikola, of course, went back several months or years earlier. Can you talk about the first time you heard of Trevor Milton and Nikola? How did that come on your radar?
It wasn't like I spend most of my days, following stocks. I just don't have time to do that in my law practice. But I was sitting in the office and I got a call one day from a guy who was a friend of Trevor Milton's down in St. George, Utah. It's about a 5-hour drive from here. So it's down in southern Utah near Zions National Park. If this guy called me and said, that he'd been doing business with Trevor Milton for some time and that something weird had happened. And doing what I do, I'm always on the lookout for interesting stories and also interesting potential cases. So this one piqued my interest, and he told me the story about how he had lent Trevor Milton, I think it was $50,000 some time ago, and it never really went anywhere. And he recently got a letter from a lawyer saying, hey, we'll give you some of your money back, but this company you invested in is out of business, so there's no money. But Trevor is such a nice guy that he's going to try to get people some of their money back. And he said that in and of itself wasn't weird, but then he had seen in the paper, our local paper here in Salt Lake, the Salt Lake Tribune, that Trevor Milton, the same guy, had just purchased a ranch for, I think it was $36 million here in the northern Utah area. And he thought that was odd. Why is he saying there's no money when he just bought a $36 million ranch? Something's going on. So that kind of got me thinking about it and got me interested in the case. I started researching who this guy was, started researching what was going on with the company. He was, at least at the time, prolific on social media, interviews. He was everywhere. He was typical of the kind of entrepreneurs that I see in my securities practice and have seen for years. So that didn't really get very far, but then I saw that this company was about to go public, or at least talking about it at that point. And so I started making phone calls, and that's kind of how the whole thing happened.
You touched on something that I found interesting, Mark. Utah has been kind of a hotbed for Ponzi fraud schemes over the years. You had talked about this with me before. Why is that?
Well, I have my own ideas. I think there's a number of different things. Different people will disagree with me about this, but I've lived here my whole life. I was raised here, and I was also raised in the Mormon church, the LDS church. They like to be called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I say they because I'm no longer affiliated with the church. but my family is. I'm very much in kind of enmeshed in the church on my family level, but also in my community where I live here in Salt Lake City. And I think, there are a lot of different theories about why that is. Some people say that Mormons are too gullible or too trusting. I think there's a piece of that a little bit, but there's a concept called affinity fraud, and affinity fraud is where people are susceptible to being pitched on a particular fraud scheme because they share some affinity for, in this case, it's they belong to the same church. So I think when people say Mormons are too trusting, I think that's generally true because they see others that attend their same church that are part of their same faith community as more trustworthy than other people. So they would feel more comfortable giving their money to someone they know, someone they attend church with, or someone who's a friend of a friend who recommends them. There's also a part of the LDS culture, which I think, and by the way, I'll use Mormon and LDS interchangeably. There's a piece of the culture that I think puts a lot of value on financial success. And financial success culturally can be equated with righteousness in the LDS culture. I don't know that that's, a doctrinal issue. It's more cultural, but, people that tend to get put into high-ranking positions in the church are people like Mitt Romney. Leadership of the Mormon Church is filled with MBAs and lawyers. There's no one in the leadership of the Mormon Church that's trained in theology. Nobody. Well, and so people are always looking for, some route to success, and believe, this is maybe a third piece of it, is they believe that if they are righteous and if they are, following the commandments and checking all the boxes, then they will be blessed in some way with financial success. I mean, people really do see a direct connection, and so these things kind of work together to create a philosophy that if you're righteous and you're a good person, someone might hit you up on an investment that has some red flags, but hey, you know what, Jeb, you're a righteous guy. You follow the commandments. You do all the stuff. You pay your tithing. Therefore, you're going to be protected from any negative fallout from this investment. Now, of course, that isn't true, but people tend to be sucked in to these fraud schemes here. There's a friend of mine, Jordan Maglich, that's down in Florida. He runs his Twitter feed. He also has a website called Ponzi Tracker. And a few years ago, he came up with a kind of a study he did of Ponzi schemes throughout the country. and I ran an analysis on that with his permission on a per capita basis. So clearly, Madoff and some of these other bigger schemes in highly populated states, there are more Ponzi schemes in bigger states, New York, Florida, California. But if you run it per capita, then Utah has by far the largest number of Ponzi schemes per capita in the country, and it's really 3 times higher than any other state almost. So we have a real problem here. I've been talking about it my whole career. I've been doing this securities. I've been in securities litigation my whole career, almost 28 years now, and I just became aware over time that this, I just kept getting call after call. Every week I would get a call from somebody, and a lot of those ended up being Ponzi schemes. And so we've had some large ones, and that's actually how I got into whistleblowing law. So I years ago when they passed the Dodd-Frank Act, I became involved in filing whistleblower tips to the SEC because I was getting a lot of calls from victims, and it was because I'd been doing this a long time. I got pretty good at kind of sniffing out unusual or illegal situations. So I started filing whistleblower cases right up when Dodd-Frank was passed initially. And I've just done it ever since. So I don't know if I answered your question, Jeb, but that's...
Yeah, no, I think it's really helpful. First off, a great public service announcement for people.
If it sounds too good to be true, it probably is. That's what I always say. If someone's offering you 40% guaranteed on your money, then just run away, because that's just a fraud scheme. There's no way.
Right. So, given that backdrop, and especially given the location of, where this business arrangement had taken place, When you started calling around and looking at some of the concerns that your client had raised with you, or potential client, um, what did you discover?
Well, I discovered that there are a lot of people in this state that Trevor Milton had done business with, who had been screwed, to use a crass term. And I talked to a number of them, and it was just the same story over and over. Yeah, he took my money, or yeah, I thought I was I thought I was an owner. It turns out I wasn't. Or he took the assets out of this company and moved them into another company that was named the same thing. The problem I had, and this is often a problem when you're trying to put together a case, and I was kind of acting like a private investigator. I was researching, trying to find people, and so I called a few people. The initial call referred me to someone he knew who worked for Trevor. I called that person. That person was willing to kind of chat with me off the record, but was not interested in becoming public or become a whistleblower, because they were afraid. They knew Trevor Milton is a vindictive guy. They didn't want to go public in any way, but they gave me some information and then said, call this guy. And that happened, I think, 3 times, until I came across a guy named Mike Shrout, also in St. George. And Mike Shrout, I can tell you his name. I don't usually give the name of the folks that I represent, but I can, because he, has gone public through the Bad Bets podcast that Wall Street Journal did. They've told his story, and it's a tragic story in a lot of ways. Mike is a really nice guy, just kind of ran across Trevor Milton when Trevor Milton was just kind of getting started. He just dropped out of the local community college in Provo and was looking to, start some company. He had started I think it was a pest control or alarm system. I think it was door-to-door company, and got to know Mike, and Mike got into business with him on this idea that involved putting making trucks, converting them to hybrid trucks, and that really was the genesis of where Nikola came from. But Mike was willing to talk, and he was someone who also had been burned. And the interesting thing about Mike is that he said to me when I called him, he said, I've been waiting for, I think, 10 years to get this call. So he had been frustrated for a long time about his business dealings, how he had been screwed over by Trevor Milton, but didn't know what to do about it, didn't have anyone to talk to, didn't have the knowledge about the whistleblower system or any of the financial fraud systems that are out there. He didn't have the resources to hire a lawyer. And when I called him, he said, this is basically the call I've been waiting for. So Mike and I started working together, and then we kind of built our team from there. Some of whom we brought on as whistleblowers, some of whom provided tips to us without becoming whistleblowers, and then it kind of grew from there.
So Mark mentioned the Bad Bets podcast that the Wall Street Journal did. We'll put a link to that for you to go and listen. We decided to reach out to Mark and have his perspective on this whole arrangement so that you have a better understanding of what a whistleblower attorney thinks through on these cases. Mark, when you reached out to Mike and you found out that he had boxes of thumb drives and whiteboards that he could map out all the stuff that had happened, what did you think?
Well, I from a lawyer's perspective, and you say, Jeb, what a whistleblower lawyer does. I mean, what we do is we hear stories. I mean, this is what I do now. It's what I've done for years now is people call us, they have an idea, they have a situation. Some of them are great, some of them are not so great. And, you get pretty good at hearing stories and kind of finding the stuff in there that might be able to be useful and some wouldn't be. And I can tell you the 2 things I typically look for is someone who has information more than just a story, but they have documents, they have other information beyond just, I was screwed by this guy, because that doesn't usually get you very far. The other thing is someone who has inside knowledge. We always look for someone who has been working closely with either the company. We love to represent internal folks who have knowledge about the accounting practices or whatever. But the other thing we always look for is a lot of money at stake. And what we knew at that point, and Mike and I knew, is that Trevor was going big time at that point. He was buying expensive ranches. He was promoting the fact that they're going to go public pretty soon. They had this SPAC deal worked out, and we knew that this was a case that the SEC would be interested in. We didn't realize how big it was going to get at that point. It was only later when, they were worth, I think, I can't remember the number, but it was like their market cap was bigger than Ford Motors at one point. So it grew fast, more than we ever anticipated. But I knew that this was a guy who had knowledge, was kind of a former insider, had dealt with Trevor personally for many years. And the company there was something going on with the company that was sketchy. And it was Mike actually who down the road, he was involved on Twitter and found our second big whistleblower. And I can tell you his name is Paul Lackey. Paul also was the first witness at the criminal trial. He's also told his story publicly, so I can use his name. But Paul was a guy who, had worked at Nikola as a contractor. He's an engineer, very smart guy, but also very honest guy. And he was very offended by what he saw Trevor was doing. He knew, because he'd been working behind the scenes, that the state of the engineering was not what Trevor was telling people it was. So he brought to the table more recent experience with Trevor. I think Mike gave us the, kind of an understanding of who this guy was. Paul confirmed that is who this guy was, and he's still doing the same conduct that Mike had been involved with initially. So the two of them began working together pretty heavily to try to put together a case. It was hard because Mike, and Mike I think would agree with this. He is kind of scattered at times. And so it was a challenge to kind of coalesce what he had into a story. And that's what we are. Whistleblower lawyers are storytellers. That's what we do. We take information from individuals that seems relevant to fraud, and we package it up and present it to the SEC in a compelling way. We tell stories. And these guys together began working on putting together the story. But it still was a struggle.
Let's go back for one second, because I find this part fascinating. So Mike is telling you what he knows. And I guess the idea was, this is great, Mike, but, what's happening at Nikola, we need somebody who has evidence of what's happening there. And I guess from what I'm understanding, Mike dives into the internet world and uncovers this guy on Twitter known as the Nikola Insider. And somehow he connects with them, right? Is that the full story on that?
Yeah, and it took a lot of work actually to convince the Nikola Insider to talk to us and reveal his identity to us confidentially. Mike was messaging him on Twitter, through the direct message function and saying, "Hey, we're working on this thing," and he didn't trust him. Everybody was scared of Trevor. Everyone we tried to talk to, this was a consistent theme. They didn't want to talk to us. They didn't want to deal with us because they were scared of retaliation, legal or otherwise. And there's some crazy stuff that happened after the fact that really showed that those fears were justified. But we did have people that were willing to talk to us and provide information to us, but not have their name used. But eventually, once we got Paul convinced that we were real, that we were not trying to be like a Trojan horse of some sort from Trevor, we were actually doing the work of trying to be a whistleblower, then he agreed to join our team. And he and Mike, are kind of engineering type people, and they talk the same talk, which I don't talk. I don't understand half the time what they're talking about. And so together they really kind of got together and were able to start building a story.
So there's an event, and we'll put a link to the video for you to watch, that took place on December 1st, 2016 in Salt Lake City, where they roll out the Nikola One, which may or may not have been a truck that actually worked at the time. And Paul was at that event, or he was at least at the stuff leading up to it. What was it about that time period that really upset Paul?
Well, he was involved in putting that truck together. The Nikola folks the company itself didn't have an internal engineering team that was big enough or sophisticated enough or experienced enough to really build what was an extremely complicated thing, which is a long haul truck that can be powered by electricity and at the time natural gas, that could pull a big load. I mean, this is not a small thing. But the engineering challenges were huge because the loads these things pull are so massive, and the weight. There's weight is a really big issue with these because a lot of the turbines and other things that have to power this, the batteries are very heavy. So this was an engineering challenge that was extremely complex, and Nikola did not have the internal folks that were capable of really pulling it off. They still arguably don't to this day. But the issue with Paul was that he had been hired as an outside contractor and was there building the truck and knew the state of the truck. And then he had to go home because he wanted to go home to his family before the actual rollout. So he left the night before, but then he watched it live stream, I think on YouTube or something, and saw that Trevor Milton was representing that this truck was not a pusher. In the automobile industry, a pusher is a car or a truck that they push onto the stage, but it's really inoperable. Looks really cool from the outside, like a concept car, but really you can't drive the thing. And when he heard Trevor say this is not a pusher, it's fully operable, et cetera, all the stuff that he said in that presentation, he knew it was just not true. I mean, he had been there the day before and knew there was literally, that truck was like a shell. Some of the stuff there, it looked good from the outside, but then the internal parts was just a totally like an empty shell almost. And so he knew that to be the case. And he testified at the criminal trial that he had heard Trevor Milton, bringing investors in day after day and made representations to them about the nature of the work that they were doing and more importantly, where they were in the stage of development that were not true. He was consistently day after day misrepresenting the status of the building product and the research and everything else. And so that just made him angry. What Trevor did kind of at the last minute, like several days before the unveiling of the truck, is he had decided that the truck was going to be run on hydrogen, not on natural gas. And that may sound like not that big of a deal, but it actually was a huge deal because the engineering challenges of hydrogen are massive. The technology is there, but the sources of hydrogen are not there. And you can't drive up to a Flying J or whatever truck stop in the middle of Iowa and fill your car up with hydrogen. There's a reason for that. And Trevor all of a sudden said, we've done it. We've figured it out. He actually used that word, we've done it. And that just wasn't true. And in fact, the equipment in that truck was not geared for hydrogen at all. That would have been a whole different set of equipment. And he's like, yeah, we've got this great team. The crazy part about that is that when we were researching this, one of the things we did is we looked at who their head of global hydrogen development is. The guy who he had put in place, Trevor had put in place as the head of hydrogen development, was his brother. And we looked up on LinkedIn, and his last job before that had been pouring concrete in Hawaii. So, I mean, it's just silly. And anyone who's doing due diligence, including General Motors, by the way, it wouldn't have taken him more than five seconds to figure this out, but no one had figured it out. And he was so offended by it. I mean, you have to know Paul, and he's just a good guy, and he's an honest guy, and he was so offended by the constant, lies that he heard Milton tell that he just wanted to do something about it. So he tried to contact Bloomberg. They didn't listen to him. He tried to contact other press. No one would listen to him. They couldn't corroborate the stories that he was telling, so they couldn't print it. And so he began kind of this mini crusade on Twitter to let people know what was really going on. I mean, it was kind of impressive what he was doing. I mean, he's exactly the kind of client I like to represent. People who just feel offended by misrepresentations and want to bring the truth to light. He didn't know that the information he had could be worth millions of dollars. He had no idea, but he does now, but he didn't at the time.
So there's a third leg of the stool that we'll get to in a second, based out in New York. But I first want to talk about this video, this Nikola in motion video that came out, and I'll add a link to that too, so you can actually watch this video of this beautiful Nikola 1 semi truck rolling through the desert in Utah. But Paul was confused because he didn't think this thing could run. But then there's this video coming out showing this truck rolling through. Can you talk about how exactly they were able to do that?
So Paul still, he saw that show up on the Twitter feed of the company, and it said Nikola in motion. And remember, no one had driven the car at that initial showing. It was on a stage, and I think there was pressure on the company to say, hey, we want to see that truck. We want to see it going, show us the goods, essentially. And so they released this video of the truck that looked like it was just driving. It was in motion. They've continually tried to say, well, we didn't say it was under its own power. But anyway, at the time, anyone who looked at this video and anyone who looks at the video that you post will see that it's very obviously made to look like it's driving. The camera angles are such that you can't see that it's actually on a hill, and so it looked like it. And Paul was confused, and he's like, "Wow, they've really made a lot of progress on this truck. That was just a shell when I left Salt Lake City. They never asked us to come back and finish it. So he texted a friend of his that was a company employee and asked him, and how did they? That person texted him back and said, no one's touched the truck since you left. And then he was able to get information that it was actually rolling down a hill. And it's a complicated story, but it took us, several weeks to track down where it was. And it was a crazy story. And it's funny because I remember when we figured this out, we were just laughing. We couldn't believe it. But what we didn't really realize is how impactful that particular piece of information was to the report that ultimately came out, that we're going to talk about in a minute. And so this is not rocket science. Some of the stuff that we uncovered was just through, searching on the internet, but putting it together in a way that enabled us to present it to the public. And like you said, that truck running down the hill, for whatever reason, I think there were other parts of the report that were more significant in terms of, why this company isn't what it claims to be. But that is really what caught the imagination of the press and the public. That was what people paid attention to.
When you're talking, I'm reminded of movie sets, the old Westerns, where you'd look at the set and it'd be a beautiful building, and then you look behind and there's nothing there. It seemed like you guys were kind of looking behind the facade here.
That's right. Yeah.
Let's talk about. Well, first off, can you explain what an activist short seller is, and then we can talk about Hindenburg. What does that mean?
So activist short sellers are out there in the market, and they are going to do research on a company that they think the public is not aware of. Then they'll take a short position in the stock, sometimes significant, sometimes not, depending on what their financial situation is. And then they will short the stock and then release the information to the public and literally hope, that the information is significant enough that it causes the stock price to drop. Then they sell the shares that they've shorted, or they close out those positions and make money that way. So they're a lot like whistleblowers. If you think about it, whistleblowers bring information to government regulators. Activist short sellers, it's still about information. It's information, but they bring the information to the market, and then hope that the information is strong enough and that their credibility is good enough that it will move the stock price in a significant way. Is that a good explanation?
Yeah, I think that's perfect. And a key point I think people need to understand is, unlike somebody going long on a stock saying that, I'm going to buy this with the hopes that it goes up, if you short a stock, your risk really is unlimited, right? If the price goes up, you're going to be out all that money as the price continues to climb. Huge risk.
A lot of people that I'm sure maybe thought they would want to get into activist short selling, and then they figured out how much risk they took on, and they didn't do it because it's it's extremely risky, and it takes incredible resources. It takes a ton of information, of I would say backbone to do it. You've got to be pretty confident in your information and how the market will take it. But of course, if no one sees your information, then it's irrelevant, right? If a tree falls in the forest and no one hears it, that's kind of the same thing. The stock's not going to move if no one listens to you. So activist shorts have to develop a reputation for giving out good information, good reports, and then more people pay attention to them, and that's kind of how it works. So reputation in that industry is significant. Muddy Waters has been in the business for a long time. They're one of the more significant players. And at the time we began working with Hindenburg, they were maybe a mid-tier group. They were kind of out there, but not that many people knew who they were.
And why did you decide to reach out to an activist short seller to help you out?
Well, it really was not about the short selling, because has nothing to do with what I do. I'm a whistleblower lawyer. We go to the SEC, but Brian Wood, who's now my law partner, we formed a new firm in the beginning of this year, Puglsey Wood, and Brian had been working with Hindenburg, and Brian and I were collaborating kind of in the background about different situations, because there just aren't that many lawyers that do what we do. So we hit it off. We've hit it off even more now that we're law partners. It's been a fantastic combination. But at the time, I said, look, I've got these guys that are working on this report, and we just need more resources. And it was really a matter of finding good researchers who could dig in and then come up with a report that was readable and made sense. And there was an additional piece to it, which is that both of my clients, and this wasn't something that I really knew about at the time, but both of my clients were able to participate with some of the profits that were made, and so it gave them a profit, some profit. It wasn't huge, but it was some profit right at the beginning. And let me just explain, if it's okay, Jeb, why that's important from my perspective, because being a whistleblower is extremely hard. The reality is that it takes a long time. I have an IRS case that's going on almost 10 years now, and my clients haven't seen a penny. So it is very hard to provide this information to the SEC. In most cases, it's the SEC. And even if they pick it up, even if they take the case, which they often don't, if they do take it, it can take years and years for that process to work itself through all the stages of investigation, litigation, settlement, the whistleblower application process, the approval process, the disputes that occur between whistleblowers about who gets what. I mean, it is a very slow, long, frustrating process. I mean, am I right on that that's a theme that
100%, 100%.
So,
yeah.
So a benefit of this that I didn't foresee, but turned out to be really great, is that the being able to participate with Hindenburg enabled my guys to get a little bit of income in the front end, not enough to retire by any stretch, but enough to kind of pay their bills. And both of them were in difficult situations financially. So it was that added benefit. But Hindenburg at the time had, I think, 5 researchers on staff who were very smart people, very smart about stock markets, about public filings, about trading in the markets, and they knew about SPACs. My guys didn't know what a SPAC was, but Nate's group did. Hindenburg knew kind of how this company had come together through a SPAC process. They were able to track all of Trevor's selling of stock, how he was able to leverage his stock to buy that $36 million cabin, how he was able to do different things that typically people don't do. One of the things they saw were all of the podcasts and interviews that he did. And so they were able to bring more of a sophisticated financial analytical mind to this research process, and began, combing through all of the online materials, all of the stuff on Twitter, and pull out specific representations that he had made. And then each time he made a representation about X, we would research that and say, was that true? Is it true that they had this, these solar panels on the roof? Is it true that all of these things happened that he said had happened, that they'd got this battery technology that was, he said it was, best in the world by far, and it was going to really change the world. We were able to research that. And in one case, we found that the battery group that he teamed up with, they were in litigation at that time. We were able to uncover a lot of things through public sourcing, but also online resources, public filings, court filings, and put together all the stuff that ended up being in that report. So that's what I needed. I needed more people. I needed more researchers to really dig into all this huge volume of information that it was just overwhelming, to be honest with you. And the report is very long. If people read it, you can still find it on Hindenburg's website. And it is long because that's, some small fraction of the information we had to work through in order to produce the report.
So let me unpack some key points there that Mark just made for you. So that keep in mind the context, the time period. This is 2020. The pandemic's going on in March 2020 as they make the decision. We're going to start going public. Nikola ended up going public June 4th, 2020. All during this time, Trevor Milton is on the circuit speaking on podcasts and talking about how they're going to revolutionize the trucking industry, and that this is ultimately going to be one of the top 5 brands maybe in the world. And they were able to quickly go public by a SPAC, special purpose acquisition company, also known as a blank check company. And that allowed them to basically go to market quicker without the scrutiny that you typically undergo when you go the IPO route, right, Mark? This allowed them to quickly go public.
It also avoids what's called the quiet period. When a company goes public, typically insiders cannot sell stock for, I think, 6 months. Going public through a SPAC avoids that quiet period, which enables the insiders, and this I'm sure is what the main reason was, is Trevor wanted his money. He wanted to start using that stock to enhance his lifestyle. I mean, he bought jets, he bought multiple houses, he bought a house. There's one in Turks and Caicos. That happened very quickly, where the company's stock was just going up. We were following everything this guy was doing. Every time he was on Instagram, all the Instagram stuff disappeared. A lot of the YouTube videos disappeared, but the other stuff is still out there. And we had it all. And we were downloading it because we knew as soon as we released this that it would disappear, and it did. So we have copies of all of it.
So just prior to publishing this report, Hindenburg published this report outlining all the things that, I forget the quote, the 1,000 lies, it was something to that effect, that were uncovered in this report. GM, General Motors, had announced that they were going to go into partnership with Nikola. You would think that they would have their own due diligence team looking behind the wall here, but they didn't.
Well, Mary Barra, when this all came out, she was very defensive of that because people were saying exactly that. But I don't know that they needed to be honest. In her defense, I think the partnership was very one-sided. Basically, Nikola, because it didn't have anything, wasn't really giving anything to GM. It was more GM was providing all these things to Nikola. It was a partnership that I think was done for PR purposes, but there was no IP, particularly as we understand it, in that deal that GM was getting. They had it all. They didn't need Nikola, but they did like the hype, I think. I think that's more of it. That's my personal opinion. And it did help their stock, and it helped Nikola's stock. I mean, this is something we didn't know was coming, by the way, Jeb. We didn't know. We would have had no way of predicting that there was going to be a deal announced just days before we were ready to publish. And in fact, Nate will tell you, Nate Anderson, that of Hindenburg will tell you that he had a lot of trepidation when he saw that deal, because he thought, well, exactly what you said. I said, well, this is GM. They've got to have a world-class legal team that's looked under every rock of this company before they would get into bed with them. Of course, we must be really wrong. And it took a lot of bravery on Nate's part to push the send button on this report, because that announcement gave him pause and gave all of us pause. We all were very concerned about what we had missed. Could we be wrong about all this stuff? But public records are out there, and we worked really, really hard. And this is another piece that Nate's group brought to the table, which is the ability to do real due diligence on all this stuff. We submitted, just for what it's worth, we submitted a whistleblower report to the SEC before the Hindenburg report came out. But they're similar. There's obviously the same issues are brought out. Then he pushed send. Most of my, 99% of my cases never are seen by the public, except this one was just unusual.
Mark said something very interesting earlier, that Paul and Mike would sometimes talk, and it's hard as a lawyer to understand what they're saying. A lot of times as whistleblower attorneys, our job is to take that language and translate it into a story that an SEC attorney or an investigator can understand and get behind. It's an important skill to have. So, Mark, late September, the report is published.
Yeah.
Were you holding your breath? Were you watching the stock price? What was going on?
It was crazy. I had, I just didn't know. I mean, I'm not an activist short seller. I'm not a big trader. But I've been doing securities law for my entire career. So I do understand the markets. And so I watched the report. I had Twitter open because Nate typically releases his reports on Twitter, and then also through an email group list that he has. And then I had also the stock price, and it just blew up on Twitter. I mean, you could really see all the retweets and all the comments just like fast. And then on the other side of the screen, I had the stock ticker open, and just was watching it tick down. And I had Mike and Paul. We were talking, we're chatting, messaging each other, and I mean, it was really it was a crazy day, because like I said, we whistleblower lawyers, we typically work in obscurity, and we kind of like that. I think for the most part, we like to. We're not like the Ketam FCA folks that are also part of TAF, where ultimately when things get public, the name of their client is on the complaint, so everybody knows who their client is. When you're doing SEC whistleblower work, all that is in the background. It's held by the SEC. The SEC does a fantastic job with their staff keeping those things confidential, sometimes overly so. But we think that we can usually give our clients a lot of comfort that the SEC is going to bend over backwards to maintain their confidentiality, and they did. Except the DOJ called us, and they wanted a copy of our report. So they work really hard to keep confidentiality, but the DOJ had disclosure obligations when the criminal case was filed. They actually had to disclose our filing to Trevor Milton's lawyers. And so all of that confidentiality that we were working so hard to maintain was out the window when the DOJ got involved. At the same time, we began to get inquiries from press. So not only did we, have this impact on the stock, but we had this impact, I think, on the market generally. A lot of people had invested in Nikola because they thought that it was going to be the next Tesla. And those folks are the people I worry about the most, because I think they many of them were true believers and probably didn't get out as quickly as some of the big funds did. But the stock ticked down very quickly and ended up losing, I think, 40% in one day. And so the Hindenburg piece, the activist short piece, was very successful from that perspective. And the whistleblower report with the SEC was also very successful. We file a lot of reports that just disappear into the ether. We don't always get calls from regulators on our cases. We wish we always did, but we don't. And so this one, I got a call the next day from the SEC. I got a call the next day from the DOJ. I mean, this one really got a lot of attention from regulators, which is fantastic. That's what we want. because that's how I get paid. So in that situation, because it was out there in the public and everyone knew what we had done, well, they knew what Nate had done, but my clients' names were nowhere in that report, and my name was nowhere in that report. So at the time, we maintained our anonymity, but gradually, what we started getting inquiries from press. We also got inquiries from movie producers and all sorts of different groups that wanted to tell the story, and so we ended up telling that story publicly for the first time with the Bad Bets podcast, because we agreed to work with them. From, like I said, I'm not used to this. This is not my normal business practice. Usually I like to be obscure and unknown. That's actually my preference. But in this case, there's a lot of interest in the story. I think it's a great story. The good news is my clients, Paul and Mike, who, they deserve a lot of credit for the hard work that they did. They really worked during COVID. They worked for almost 4 months, 12, 13, 14-hour days every day, putting together this stuff. And they, to their credit, were able to take a victory lap, I guess, through this podcast and be introduced to the world as the guys that did this. It's just really 2 guys plus Nate's team. Christine did a great job, and Chris and the guys that are interviewed. And I think, I just think it's fantastic that my guys were able to get a little credit for this hard work and bravery that they had in kind of coming forward. The other thing that has been interesting is as we've become more public on this stuff, people, I think the good news is through your podcast, Jeb, and through other news sources, people are becoming more aware of the whistleblower program. I think it's fantastic. I hope there's more people who have knowledge of fraud that are willing to come forward and bring it to the SEC's attention, because frankly, people like Trevor Milton need to be stopped.
To your point, Mark, the report comes out 2 weeks later, Trevor resigns, and then 2 years later, you're sitting in a courtroom in the Southern District of New York, and Paul's taking the stand as the opening witness in the criminal trial against Trevor Milton.
So it was pretty crazy. And Paul is a very shy guy. He doesn't like to be in the spotlight, but he's passionate in his own way. And he also, I remember he said he needed a suit. We were talking actually to the DOJ, and I pointed out, I said, Paul, I think you need to have a suit when you testify in federal court in a high profile case. And he said, well, I don't have a suit. Turns out he borrowed a jacket and it was really a sport coat. He didn't even wear a suit, but he wore that at the trial. He borrowed it from his dad, and some shoes that he'd worn at his wedding. And then we went out and we celebrated. We had a great dinner. Nate came down. We were all there in the courthouse during opening arguments, and everyone got to meet each other. And then we, went out to dinner and got to know each other much better over that week, and had a blast. And it was super fun. And I'm so glad that Mike flew out. Mike wasn't asked to testify, but he is going through a hard time. And I didn't really know this at the time, that his wife had cancer, and she passed away 3 days ago. So, and Mike's he's a young guy. I mean, his wife was in her 40s, I think, but it was, this has been a hard time for all of us, and we want to support Mike. And, but anyway, he got to have this time in New York. It was Paul and Mike's first time in New York. First time, Paul's from Portland and Mike's from a small town in Utah. So this was the big city, and being in the public eye and having the press around and being hit up for interviews. It was very, very heady stuff for them. And I'm very excited that they were able to get credit for the work that they do. It was great. It was just super great.
So speaking of credit, Nikola has wrote a big check, $125 million, I believe, to the SEC. You guys are, of course, waiting on whether or not you're going to receive a whistleblower reward. Looking back on this, General Motors may or may not have had an adequate due diligence process. The investment community didn't uncover this. There were other people that could have stepped forward and probably didn't, or maybe didn't. And, the retail investment community really had no clue what was happening here. I think this is a great example of why the SEC whistleblower program is so important.
I absolutely agree. I mean, it's crazy to me. Trevor didn't have a huge engineering staff, but he did have a general counsel on staff. And it's crazy to me why his, management team, his legal team didn't shut him down. They knew the stuff that he was saying was not true. Subsequently, there was a internal investigation, which, became public and we were able to see it. I think the firm of Kirkland and Ellis did it. I mean, it must have cost millions. And they basically confirmed almost all of the allegations in our report. I mean, all the key allegations were confirmed, and they were confirmed by high up executives in the company. And many of the comments that were quoted in this report were, we knew he was saying stuff. We kept telling him to stop saying stuff. He wouldn't stop. We tried to change they changed the login password for the company Twitter account, and he figured it out. He got through it. I mean, it's crazy. These guys are he won't listen to his legal people. He doesn't understand that there's huge consequences when you're running a public company for misleading the public about your prospects and your technology. I mean, he's going to go to prison probably for 20 years because he couldn't shut his mouth. And there was nobody behind him saying, you need to stop talking. You need to stop lying about what's going on in this company. And it's crazy to me. So when you have a situation like that, how do you stop it? Well, clearly the legal department at the company couldn't stop it. The other executives couldn't stop it. So the investors just think everything's hunky dory. They don't realize what a disaster this company was. It took outside whistleblowers like my clients to come forward and bring this stuff to the attention of regulators to shut it down. And that's really unfortunate because that's not the way it should happen. I mean, good infrastructure in a company like that none of this would happen in the first place, and investors wouldn't have relied on all of these statements that he made that were false. So, big companies typically are better at kind of managing the outflow of information by their CEO or through their social media accounts, through press releases. All of that is carefully regulated in a public company, carefully monitored. But Trevor, maybe because he was unsophisticated, he didn't have a business degree, who knows, for whatever reason, he was not able to shut it down, and he was not able to monitor it in any way, any effective way. And no one else was, apparently. So what happened? It required us, our ragtag team of researchers, to come together and spend 4 months doing a deep dive into this company, and we were able to uncover all this stuff. So it's unfortunate because frankly, if he'd had good people behind him and if he was willing to listen to him, none of this would have happened, and he wouldn't be going to prison right now.
Mm. So as Mark said, sentencing scheduled for July of 2023. January of 2023. I'm off on my calendar here. January 2023. I'm guessing he'll probably look to appeal at some point. So we'll watch this case very closely. It's very interesting to a lot of people here to see what happens here. Mark, I really appreciate you sharing your story with us.
Well, thanks for having me, Jim. It's fun to talk about it, and I hope that people will take note and realize that there's companies all over the place where this kind of stuff's happening, and become a whistleblower. So we're looking forward to additional funds coming in that we'll be able to benefit from, and it'll be great. I'm proud of my clients. They did a fantastic job, and they really were able to stop an ongoing scheme that is now over. And this guy's going to go to prison, and it is what it is.
What a story. If you want to make sure you follow us on the upcoming episodes, head over to taf.org, TAF.org. Sign up for our newsletter where you'll get notified about upcoming episodes and everything that's happening in the underworld of corporate fraud. Until then, this is Fraud in America. We hope you enjoyed today's episode of Fraud in America. This show is possible because of the generous support of the whistleblower law firm Getnick and Getnick LLP. Information about this firm is available at getnicklaw.com. If you believe you have witnessed fraud against the government or fraud on the financial markets, we encourage you to visit our website at taf.org, where you will find a directory of member attorneys who represent whistleblowers across the country. This episode was edited and produced by Rachel Brooks, and our show's theme song is by Connor Chaos. A special thank you to the TAF staff and researchers, including Jackie DeMar, James King, Kate Scanlon, and Max Voldman. Fraud in America is a special project of Taxpayers Against Fraud Education Fund. The opinions expressed on the show belong solely to the guest and are not necessarily endorsed by the organization. Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Fraud in America.